This video is based on my new book, Godmindfamily, The Human Mind, Behaviour, Symptoms, the Family, Society, Politics, and God's Kingdom Explained. It's available free on my website, robertensor.com, and you can buy it from Amazon in ebook and paperback formats via the links in the description below. So, the pioneering family therapist Murray Bowen was right to draw analogies between the functioning of family systems and national systems. If a country functions like a family, the government, and especially the leader, is the dominant paternal or maternal figure, and the citizens or subjects are the children. At the national scale, the chief mechanism for the deceiver's false beliefs and concomitant anxiety to disrupt the system is obviously via the primary sources of information in a society: schools, universities, the internet, religious institutions, and the media, including social media, news media, and entertainment media, which are of huge importance and can do a lot of damage to the society and the health of its citizens. That doesn't guarantee that the curriculum and media will be dominated by the deceiver, but it means that they will be targeted by him. It is of vital importance to the healthy functioning of a state that the schools, universities, religious institutions, and media are mostly telling the truth, which will create a more permissive environment for good legislation and executive decisions, as well as better outcomes in elections where applicable. As Andrew Breitbart noted, politics is downstream from culture, at least in a democracy. Laws and collective behavior are the product of a society's beliefs, and beliefs are largely determined by information. Conformity is the act of matching attitudes and behaviors to the norms of a particular group in order to fit in. If the appalling records of human history and everyday experience are not enough, psychology has provided abundant evidence of the destructive effects of social conformity and misplaced obedience to authority figures. A classic example is the famous 1951 study by Solomon Asch, in which groups of 8 male students were selected. 7 of them were actor Confederates. One was a genuine test subject. The groups were given a simple question with an obvious correct answer: which of these lines is the same length as the line on the other chart? The actors gave deliberately wrong answers, and 36% of the subjects also answered incorrectly to conform. Then there was the notorious 1971 Stanford prison experiment directed by Philip Zimbardo and funded by the US Navy. The goal was to evaluate how people conform to their assigned roles. Zimbardo accepted volunteers from the Stanford University student body and split them into two groups, guards and inmates. They were given uniforms. The guards wound up tyrannizing, abusing, and humiliating the inmates, and the experiment had to be called off on the sixth day. Stanley Milgram also conducted an experiment on obedience to authority, an important part of conformity, since it is normally the leader who sets the tone for the group. Milgram placed subjects in a room with a learner, actually an actor, and had a white-coated researcher order subjects to electroshock the learners when the learners gave a wrong answer. There weren't really any electroshocks, but the actors simulated the effects, including slumping over on their desk, apparently unconscious. The experiment was replicated throughout the US and other countries. In a meta-analysis, it was found that an average of 61% of subjects were prepared to administer a fatal voltage. Groupthink is a social psychological phenomenon whereby a group's desire for conformity and harmony produces irrational decisions and collective behavior. The group agrees at all costs, in some cases. The term groupthink was coined by William H. White. White focused on the deleterious effects of groupthink in the context of American corporations in the 1950s. Groupthink also has very important political consequences. In his book, Victims of Groupthink, Irving Janis cited the US's lack of preparedness for the Pearl Harbor attacks and the US invasion of Vietnam as prominent examples of groupthink in the foreign policy arena, all of which had disastrous effects. Subsequently, the Watergate scandal, the Nazis' decision to invade Russia in 1941, that led to their total demise, the 2003 US invasion of Iraq, and social media echo chambers have been correctly identified as instances of groupthink. It should be noted that while groupthink played a role in all of the above examples, not all of the aforementioned disasters were disadvantageous to everyone. Janice cited 8 symptoms of groupthink: illusions of the group's invulnerability, engendering arrogant recklessness; dogmatic belief that the group is morally right at all times; rationalizing warnings that challenge the group's beliefs; stereotyping the opponents of the group as biased, weak, ignorant, evil, and generally bad and not worth listening to, self-censorship of controversial or out-of-the-box ideas among group members, illusions of unanimity among the group's leadership when group members may not be unanimous but simply afraid to speak up, pressure to conform applied to anyone who deviates from the group orthodoxy, mind guards, group members who protect the group from dissent. Janice believed that when a group exhibits most of these symptoms, a bad decision is sure to follow that generally includes a failure to consider alternative courses of action. He was right. In fact, groupthink is the norm rather than the exception in human groups, from informal gangs of friends in high school to policy-making cliques at the heart of government. It is totally obvious that Western politically correct ideology is the product of groupthink, as Christopher Booker pointed out. The movement unquestionably ticks all 8 boxes, just like other forms of Marxism in the past, especially the self-censorship and stereotyping of opponents. In Stalinist Russia, they called them exploiters. In Maoist China, they called them rightists. But these are all just labels for people the in-group does not agree with, and typically the terms are psychological projection too. Accusations are often confessions, especially when they are made by ideologues. The spit-frothing fanatic pointing the trembling finger while shrieking "J'accuse" is almost invariably guilty of the same crime. For example, Mussolini was a socialist before becoming a fascist. His regime incorporated socialist ideas and he persecuted and killed socialists. Hypocrisy is the rule, not the exception. Some people don't even understand why they hold the beliefs they do, but they are nonetheless willing to go after those who don't agree with them. This is the hallmark of groupthink. Groupthink is a top-down phenomenon in which the group's leader, a person who is role modeled and feared by many, sets the agenda and his acolytes follow their Pied Piper until they are well and truly lost. Increasingly, beliefs are adopted not as a consequence of a painstaking and well-researched quest for truth, but because they are regarded as coming from some prestigious body of experts and acquire their prestige merely through constant repetition by the relevant authorities, especially via the media and social media. Those beliefs are then regurgitated very confidently secondhand as if they were obviously true, especially when they are total nonsense. Janice outlined 3 causes of groupthink: high group cohesion, situational issues like external threats to the group, and recent failures and structural faults, such as the group's insulation from wider society, biased leadership, and homogeneous backgrounds of the group's membership. Although high cohesion does not always entail groupthink, and groups lacking cohesion can also be flawed in different ways, low harmony groups do not suffer from groupthink. There are some ways to combat groupthink: encouragement of dissent, routine consideration of alternatives, the selection of a good experienced leader or manager who is open-minded, the permanent appointment of an advocate of the opposing view, and consultation with outside experts. There have been relatively few follow-up empirical studies on groupthink. Conformity and groupthink are emotional fusion with society, a group or an ideology. But again, this kind of fusion is a function of the beliefs that one chooses to adopt. Now, if you want to find out more about fusion, that has been described in a previous video about Murray Bowen's family systems theory. So an example of social fusion is that if one believes that fitting in is all important, then that enables fusion with the mores of a particular group and adherence to their groupthink. Conformity, groupthink, and social fusion are fueled by the pervasive fear of social exclusion, the desire to fit in, and the material perks that come with being accepted, such as easier access to high status jobs, friends, money, sex, and even love. Yes, many people will not love someone unless they are a conformist who subscribes to fashionable opinions, wears the right clothes, drives the right car, lives in the right neighborhood, and talks in the right way for their in-group, which gives you some idea of what their love is worth. Bowen knew about the dangers of fusion with society, but society's downward spiral has dramatically worsened since his death in the 90s, and social fusion now typically represents a bigger danger than it used to. Ironically, the people whom Bowen and Kerr would call high self-differentiation are often fused with society, at least in recent times, because that fusion made it easier for them to exhibit the hallmarks of Bowen and Kerr's definition of self-differentiation, which includes a stable marriage, degree, successful employment, etc. So I'll provide a more extreme example that illustrates my point. Dissidents in North Korea who are not fused with society are swiftly imprisoned or executed. If the individual had a family and a job, he would thereby lose them. If he did not, he wouldn't live long enough to start a family or find work. Needless to say, this is a significant limitation of Bowen's conception of self-differentiation. In The Undiscovered Self and other writings, Carl Jung, the psychiatrist, warned that society was becoming increasingly dominated by collectivist ideology and totalitarian states, leading to mass repression and projection of the shadow onto enemy countries and groups. Jung saw self-knowledge, particularly of the shadow and private religious experiences, as buffers against the power of totalitarianism. It was the collective carnage of the First World War that prompted Freud to develop his concept of the death drive, the urge for aggression and self-destruction in human beings. This was the closest Freud came to the idea of social fusion. Jung saw this phenomenon and he called it possession by the persona archetype that mass people wear to operate in society and conceal their undesirable traits. What Jung didn't realize is that if you don't want hollow validation, there is actually no need for a persona or a vastly reduced need for one. If someone has a strong mask, it's because they are ashamed of their true self and want to hide it. And it's unfortunate that so many people fear their peers' disapproval more than they fear God. When Judgment Day comes, the trendy will say, but everyone was doing it and Jesus will not be impressed.